So I'm going to tell you a bit of a tale today about this butterfly, which is the northern brown argus. About 8 years ago, Butterfly Conservation embarked on a volunteer-led project about this butterfly, and we've been on a bit of a journey ever since. So I'm just going to tell you about kind of how that's gone, what we've done with the data, what the challenges have been, and what the next steps are. So northern brown argus has already been mentioned a few times today, which is really nice. So for anybody who doesn't know about the butterfly, I'm just going to give a bit of background to it. So the northern brown argus is a small butterfly, and despite its brown colour, it is in the blues family. So if you know your common blue or your small blue butterfly, which are also found in the borders, the northern brown argus is quite closely related to them. I say it's small; it's about the size of a 50p piece, so it's not the biggest species. As the name suggests, it is northern in its distribution, so it's adapted for colder climates. So it should suit Scotland quite well. In Scotland, we've got a happy identification feature with northern brown argus in that it's got a white dot on the wing. If you go south of the border, that dot becomes black, and it looks an awful lot like its sister species, which is the brown argus. But in Scotland, there's no identification problems. If you find a small brown butterfly with a white dot on the wing, it'll be a northern brown argus. And it's sometimes been known as Scotland's butterfly because it was first documented to science from Edinburgh, where the butterfly was found on Arthur's Seat, Salisbury Crag. You can still find it there today. So there's not many butterflies that have been documented for the first time from science from Scotland, I can tell you that. Um, in terms of its habitat, it's kind of linked into very much what people were saying this morning. Alistair and Epiphany about its habitat. So it likes calcareous grasslands, essentially, whether it's uplands or lowlands. In the borders, it's mostly on the uplands or upland fringe. And that's because its sole food plant is the common rock rose. So that is the only plant that the caterpillar will eat. So the butterfly is inevitably found where common rock rose is. As it's not a big butterfly, it's not a strong flyer. It doesn't tend to stray very far from. So it tends to inhabit kind of species-rich grassland. As I say, kind of on the upland fringe or at the coast. It could be on a road verge, it could be in a corner of a field. Sometimes it can be half a hillside, but quite often these patches are really quite small, and it's common rock rose is usually found amongst your kind of other kind of upland calcareous plants that you would expect. Often it's found alongside burns and streams, where the streams have cut through and exposed some calcareous sediments and soils. Rock rose tends to grow where the soils are quite thin, so it quite often is found in quite thin rocky soil areas. And northern brown argus seems to have this amazing ability to find these patches of habitat and survive in them. So you can walk for a kilometre, not see any rock rose, find a patch where there's literally two plants, but the butterfly is surviving on those two plants. It's much better at finding rock rose than I am, and probably than any of us are, really. Um, in terms of management for the species, generally kind of extensive grazing of livestock works quite well for it. So cattle works quite well, sheep can work well in certain situations. Not all sites are grazed, but many are. In terms of its distribution in Scotland, you can see from this map that it's fairly eastern. So don't worry about the colour of the dots, but you can just see that all the records are mostly in eastern Scotland, apart from the southwest, where you can find it up to the coast of Ayrshire, as well as along the Saltway. But relevant today is obviously this area here, the borders, which is a huge stronghold for the species. So currently we know of around 550 places where northern brown argus has been recorded in Scotland. We're slowly working our way through mapping most of those. So we're pretty confident that on the locations about 400 with others to be mapped out, but there's clearly a lot of colonies. But in the Scottish borders, there's 180, and that's 33% of the Scottish total and 25% of the UK total. So the Scottish borders is clearly at least a stronghold, if not. if not the most important area in the UK for this butterfly. These are where Northern Brown Argus is found in the borders. So each orange circle represents what we believe is a colony. So you can see there's a good number at the coast, and then mostly they are following the river valleys and catchments as you move into the uplands. So whether that's the Ale or the Leader or the Gala, you can follow Northern Brown Argus colonies up these catchments. There's far fewer colonies in the kind of like what I would say was be the lower Tweed, where it turns to more arable land. Um, it is a butterfly that's in trouble. So um, this data is taken from the State of UK Butterflies 2022 report, which came out last year, and that looked at trends for all butterflies in the UK. And for butterflies, we tend to look at abundance trends and distribution trends. So abundance is how many you see on a site each year, and distribution is looking at its range. And both of these measures declined by at least 50% in those time periods given. So clearly this is a butterfly that's suffering, and for one of those reasons, or for those reasons, we've been put on the Scottish Biodiversity List, and it's a species where negative impacts should be avoided. And the reason it's declining is what we've all heard about today already. I don't think I need to go into detail about that, but it's the decline in species-rich grasslands, of course. So moving into specifically about what we've been working on in the borders. I say we, this isn't really any of my work, as you'll find out. So in 2016, a chap called Barry Prater, who I think is probably quite well known to many of you, alongside some other volunteers, some of whom are in the audience, got quite interested in the condition of Northern Brown Argus colonies and worried that they might be in trouble in the borders. Some sites have been flagged up that were becoming scrubbed up or being taken over by bracken, and there were some sites that had been planted on with woodlands. So Barry took it upon himself to map out all the colonies locally in the borders, and he basically just started asking people to visit some of them and to report back on what they found. Over a couple of years, that morphed into a more formal survey, where he specifically sought out volunteers and asked a lot of people to go out and visit these sites. And the survey basically had three aims. So Barry was asking people, could they find common rock rose, and could they tell us where it was on that site? Like specifically map it with a grid reference, so that we knew whether there was two plants in a corner of a field or whether it was half a hillside. Could they find Northern Brown Argus? So Northern Brown Argus is quite good to survey for, because unlike most butterflies, you don't need to go out in good weather if you're prepared to look for the eggs. So the eggs are laid on the top of rock rose leaves and are quite conspicuous and distinctive. And if you've got the patience and willingness to bend down with a hand lens and look for them, you can quite readily find them. And you don't need a sunny day to do it. Whereas if you want to see the adults, you really do need a sunny day and quite often a bit of luck, because a lot of the colonies are quite small in size, and it's not always easy to track down the adult butterflies. So yeah, the survey asked, could you find Northern Brown Argus as an adult or an egg? And thirdly, could you appraise the site and think about it in terms of its condition? Was there any obvious things going on with the site, anything that might have changed? And through this, we were able to build up quite, well, an amazing picture over a few years of Northern Brown Argus in the borders. So the survey results, most of these surveys took place in the period 2016 to 2021-22, with a few in the years since. So to date, 343 site visits have taken place. Over 40 volunteers have taken part, and 168 sites have been surveyed and mapped. Northern Brown Argus has been found at 75% of those sites. And common rock rose was found at 98% of them. So my tentative interpretation of that is that whilst rock rose has been able to survive quite well at most sites, it's probably declined um, at some sites. Um, and partly that's because so something like overgrazing, rock rose can survive quite well when it's being overgrazed, but the butterfly doesn't necessarily like it, or it can survive under a bit of shade for a while, but the butterfly might not like it. So we think there's been declines associated with declining habitat quality, and that's probably why this butterfly doesn't look to have survived at as many sites. It's probably true that northern brown Argus is still present at some of those 25% of sites where it wasn't found. Along the way in all of this survey, 36 new colonies of the butterfly were discovered, um, which probably, without a huge concerted effort to find them, these were kind of chance finds, a little bit of promotion. So it's probably quite likely there's quite a lot more to be found out there. Really, anywhere with rock rose is likely to harbour the butterfly. Um, and then the interesting bit for us in looking at the threats and what was identified as potential threats to the colonies. So 72, which was about half of sites with threat data, came back as having no current threat. And then the other ones are probably quite familiar. So bracken and scrub invasion made up quite a proportion of that. Some sites were still being overgrazed. We are assuming the bracken invasion and scrub invasion is mainly due to agricultural abandonment and sites that used to be grazed that aren't grazed anymore, that Epiphany and Alistair mentioned earlier, those kinds of issues. But the one I want to go into a bit more detail on is forestation, which is an increasing issue, or has been an increasing issue in the time period that we were looking at these surveys, particularly in the borders. So we looked a little bit at where forests are being planted in Scotland, and so this is looking at forestry grant scheme data in the period 2015 to 19. And the graph is basically showing selected areas of Scotland and where the greatest pressure from tree planting is. And so on the scale is about the percentage of land area that had been approved for woodland creation grants. And the Scottish Borders is clearly the highest area in Scotland. We're in that 5 years, more than 0.5% of land in the entire area was earmarked for woodland creation. So quite a significant area, really. And that's just a time snap of 4 or 5 years. And that's all different types of planting, whether it's kind of commercial Sitka or plantations or broadleaves. So essentially, pressures from planting in Scotland are not equally distributed, and the Scottish Borders is a prime area, or has been identified as a prime area for woodland expansion for various reasons, probably to do with timber growth, but as well also land availability is key. So what we did was we realized we had this data. So this is a snapshot of one of our maps. This is the Yarrow Valley in the Borders. And so each of these red areas is where we've mapped northern brown Argus habitat. So we know there's rock rose basically in those red polygons. And for the polygons that for the sites that we haven't surveyed, we were able to kind of approximate that probably the northern brown Argus colonies there. We'll try and get around to surveying it, but at least we can put a shading around it for now. So that's those hatched areas. And we realized we had this data, so we should share it with those who are establishing woodlands. Because if we can talk to woodland agents at an early stage, we can help exclude this land from planting schemes. Often it's just tweaking the planting plan a little bit, moving a deer fence perhaps to exclude the habitat from being planted on. But as I think it was Ruben mentioned earlier, this isn't a perfect system at all, because whilst you might be saving the colony and the grassland for a little while, ultimately stock's been removed because there's been a wide-scale change of land use from grazing stock to woodland. So even if you can keep the colony outside the deer fence, the likelihood is that the habitat's going to become rank, the grassland will become rank, that scrub and bracken will move in. So it's certainly not a perfect way. It's almost like a temporary sticking plaster to um, to do this, to try and secure colonies. And I've highlighted the word connectivity there in that sentence because ultimately that's what makes the borders the strongest area for northern brown Argus in Britain. It's that these river valleys, these catchments, are really quite well connected at the moment, and that the grasslands are relatively well connected, and the butterfly can be relatively well connected. And we know from decades of studies of butterflies that one of the biggest threats to butterflies is isolation, and that where colonies become isolated, they die out, and the chances of conserving them long term are very poor. So this is what we need to conserve, and it comes back to that landscape scale planning of where you put your woodlands, where you manage your grasslands. So the next step in this story for us really is a new project that we've been working up for the last few years. It's taken 4 years to bring it together. My colleague Tom Prescott, who I know some of you know quite well, has been working away on this for all of that time to try and bring this together. And it's all based on that data that Barry collected with all the help from the volunteers and the borders. So it's got this utterly appalling title of Farmers, Landowners, Northern Brown Argus and Species Rich Grassland. I take absolutely zero responsibility for that title. But it's one of 6 new natural capital projects that have been developed through the Borderlands Inclusive Growth Deal. And well, what the project really aims to do is to support farmers to maintain species-rich grassland under sustainable land management practices. And when we say sustainable, we mean sustainable in all aspects, not just for the butterfly or the grassland, but sustainable for the farmer as well. He's got to make a living off the land. And by blending kind of traditional methods for managing species-rich grassland, but also trying to bring in some of the new technologies. What we hope is that what we will gather in the project is information that can go towards a future effective agri-environment scheme that will actually deliver for farmers, for the grassland, and for the butterflies. So we've got to find some information to put into that. So we will be trialing, it might be a robo-mower for scrub or grassland. We'll certainly be looking at cattle collars for no fence grazing. Thank you. And we're also going to be looking at natural capitals, as mentioned, is a big part of it. So we're going to be looking at the value of species-rich grassland. It's a bit of a dark art to me, but Tom's been immersing himself in this world for a few years to try and bring it together. So we'll be looking at things like the carbon value of grasslands, and at the other end of the scale, the value of the beef that's come off grass-fed systems, which is obviously quite different to what you might be buying in Tesco or whatever. So there's an awful lot to play with in there. We'll also be doing some of the more traditional things that butterfly conservation might do in a project. So we'll be training volunteers, we'll be talking to landowners and giving advice. We'll be having volunteer work parties to work to improve sites, and we'll be supporting students to carry out projects to study all of this. This is a pretty major project for us because it's going to last for a minimum of 6 years. And we've secured, I think it's £700,000 towards it. We're shortly going to be recruiting a project officer to manage it. But I guess what I want to finish by saying is that 8 years ago, Barry embarked on that little project to map northern brown Argus colonies in the borders. And well, he got an awful lot of help with volunteers to get there. But he asked me not that long ago, you know, what's the data being used for? Has it been a worthwhile use of time? And yeah, we've secured a huge project out of it. So I think it just goes to show what you can achieve with a bit of recording, and without data, we don't have anything really. Thank you.